Welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating collection of insights you've shared on the shifting global landscape. We're focusing particularly on the growing influence of the BRICS nations.
Yeah, you've sent over some really compelling material from various sites, and, our goal here is to kind of extract the key knowledge, connect those dots, and, really understand the bigger picture together.
Absolutely. And what's immediately striking, I think, is just the sheer scope of what we're looking at today.
It really is. I mean, you've got discussions covering everything from the future of artificial intelligence within BRICS economies, the nuances of U.S.-South Africa relations.
Which seem particularly tense right now.
Definitely. Then there's Canada's potential role, which is interesting. The dynamic between China and India within BRICS, always fascinating.
Right, the elephant and the dragon, as they say.
Exactly. Plus, innovative uses of sports for diplomacy, Iran's expanding influence through BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's a lot. It's a truly interconnected set of developments that, they really speak to a world in flux.
A world in flux is a good way to put it. So to really kick things off, let's maybe look at where the BRICS nations are actually heading. Our sources highlight some key priorities, especially as they prepare for their big summit in Brazil. That's July 2025, right?
That's right. And it seems like there's already, a lot of groundwork being laid. What's fascinating is this proactive approach they're taking.
Proactive how?
Well, even back in March of this year, apparently there were significant discussions happening, ministerial meetings, even input from Brazil's central bank, which is interesting.
Okay, so they're getting down to details early. What are the focus areas?
They really signal where BRICS sees the future, I think. Things like artificial intelligence, the growth of digital economies, securing food supplies, a huge one, sustainable tourism, and also strengthening the role of family agriculture.
Right, and it wasn't just like vague talk, was it? The discussion seemed to have been quite specific based on the materials.
Very specific. For instance, in science and technology, they marked, I think it was a decade since their initial agreement.
Yeah, 10 years.
So they had a steering committee meeting focused specifically on long-term tech and innovation collaboration. That feels, like a real commitment to building something lasting, not just short-term fixes.
Yeah, that long-term view seems critical.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's, I think, a clear indication that BRICS nations aren't just content to be consumers of technology developed elsewhere. They're actively aiming to become key drivers of innovation within their own economies. The agricultural discussions were similarly detailed, looking at sustainable practices, new ways to finance agriculture, and crucially, expanding their presence in international markets.
And that digital certification idea for trade.
Yes. That push for digital certification to streamline trade in agricultural goods, that's a particularly smart, practical step.
That makes perfect sense, just cutting through the red tape to boost trade between the member nations. And the fintech discussions you mentioned, with Brazil's central bank taking a leading role, that sounds pretty essential for deeper economic ties, too.
Well, what's really interesting is the multi-layered strategy here. It's not just one thing. So alongside these kind of high-level fintech discussions, there were also webinars focusing on digital transformation and applying AI specifically for small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs.
Ah, okay. So bringing it down to the business level, too.
Exactly. The goal seems to be leveling the playing field, making SMEs more competitive across the BRICS nations, and, truly harnessing the power of the data economy. Their ambition is pretty clear, move beyond just exporting raw data.
Which many developing countries do.
Right. And instead become major players in developing key global technologies themselves.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit tricky. The discussions also acknowledged some pretty significant hurdles, didn't they? Like the different national rules around data, the lack of a unified global framework. That seems like a major challenge.
Oh, they absolutely are challenges, huge ones. But, these challenges also present a unique opportunity. One source we looked at suggests that BRICS collaboration in navigating these complex data regulations could actually potentially pave the way for new global standards.
Really? So BRICS could set the benchmark?
Well, the idea is that if these diverse nations can find common ground on data policy, it could potentially influence international norms down the line. It's quite significant if they pull it off.
That's definitely one to watch. And let's not overlook the tourism aspect either. It sounds like they're really keen on boosting travel within the BRICS countries and maybe more broadly across the global south.
Absolutely. The focus there was on making tourism more accessible, more sustainable, attracting digital nomads from within the BRICS nations themselves.
That's a growing market.
Huge. And also fostering partnerships between governments and private companies to create financial incentives. There's an upcoming in-person tourism meeting in May, apparently, followed by a ministerial-level discussion. So it really underscores their commitment to growing the sector.
Okay, now this statistic really jumped out at me when I was going through the materials. The BRICS nations collectively produce a massive 42% of the world's food. 42%.
Incredible figure.
But many of these same nations still grapple with food insecurity. That just seems like a fundamental paradox.
It really highlights a critical issue, doesn't it? It's likely around distribution, access, maybe the types of agricultural practices that have been prioritized historically.
So what are they discussing to fix it?
Well, the discussions around strengthening family-run farms and establishing strategic food reserves are directly aimed at tackling that paradox. The ultimate goal seems to be stabilizing food prices and ensuring everyone has access to healthy, diverse food options. There was a quote, I think, from Brazil's Minister of Agrarian Development, emphasizing that hunger isn't inevitable if you have the right public policies, which, really hits home.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so shifting gears a bit from looking ahead to some current geopolitical friction. The relationship between the U.S. and South Africa appears to be going through a particularly tense period right now.
Yeah, tense might be an understatement. What's fascinating here, though, is how multi-layered these tensions are. You've got the backdrop of U.S. threats, potential sanctions related to South Africa's land reform legislation.
Right, that's been bubbling for a while.
It has. But now it's escalated to the quite dramatic move of expelling South Africa's ambassador from the U.S.
Which is a big step diplomatically.
Huge. And the perspective offered by Professor de Carvalho in one of your sources is really key here, he argues, essentially, that the situation is more intricate than maybe the initial reports suggested and perhaps isn't fully understood by external observers.
How so? Because the initial U.S. narrative seemed to center on concerns about racial sensitivities, potential impact of the Land Reform Act on minority groups, that kind of thing.
Right. But Professor de Carvalho points out that the legislation itself is designed to address historical injustices, and importantly, it includes constitutional safeguards. It's not, just arbitrary land seizures, as sometimes portrayed.
Okay, so if it's not just the land reform, what's the underlying cause of this friction, according to him?
He suggests, and it seems plausible, that the core issue is likely South Africa's decision to bring that case against Israel at the International Court of Justice.
Ah, the ICJ case.
Yeah. That has clearly caused significant strain with the U.S., which is, of course, a very close ally of Israel.
Which puts South Africa in a really delicate position then. They're trying to navigate this relationship with what one source described as a more erratic U.S. administration, while balancing their need to maintain strong economic ties. The U.S. is their second largest trading partner, right? After China.
That's right. Balancing that need with their desire to pursue a more diversified foreign policy, it's a tough spot.
And the uncertainty around the renewal of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that just adds another layer of complexity to this whole balancing act.
Precisely. And it's also important to remember, as one source noted, South Africa's pretty consistent stance on Palestinian solidarity since its transition to democracy. So from a domestic political perspective, their ICJ action might not have been as perhaps surprising as it seemed internationally.
So how is South Africa responding to the ambassador's expulsion?
It seems quite measured, actually. The sources suggest they're actively considering diversifying their international partnerships, maybe looking more towards the global south. Southeast Asia, Latin America are mentioned, and also strengthening existing relationships like with the African Union and perhaps some European nations.
So keeping options open.
Exactly. This measured response, coupled with exploring alternative alliances, really just underscores that inherent tension we talked about. South Africa's economic reliance, to a degree, on the U.S. market, alongside China's growing economic influence in the region. It's a complex geopolitical balancing act they're performing, day in, day out.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to Brazil. They're holding the BRICS presidency in 2025, but they're taking on this leadership role at a time when they're facing their own set of, domestic challenges.
Yeah, it's really interesting how a nation's internal political and economic landscape can significantly shape its international priorities, isn't it? Brazil's BRICS presidency coincides with this period of significant political polarization at home, plus economic headwinds, slower growth, shocks to business confidence, fluctuating exchange rates.
And Lula's government is still facing considerable opposition from supporters of the previous administration, too.
Right, there's that constant pressure. But despite these internal pressures, it seems Brazil has outlined some pretty clear priorities for its time leading the BRICS bloc.
What are those key priorities?
Well, a key focus seems to be a broader reflection on the current state of international institutions and the principles of multilateralism itself. They also apparently aim to build on the discussions they've initiated during their G20 presidency.
Which they hold currently.
Exactly. Focusing on critical global issues like forming a global alliance against poverty and hunger, tackling climate change, addressing international taxation, that's a big one, and pushing for reforms to international financial institutions.
And hosting COP30 in the Amazon, that's huge for them, too.
Incredibly important, yes. It ties into their climate leadership ambitions.
So it sounds like Brazil really sees an opportunity here to collaborate with other BRICS and Global South countries, especially given, the current high levels of uncertainty in the international arena.
I think that's exactly right. In a world where many nations are actively seeking to diversify their relationships, reduce their exposure to various international risks, BRICS offers, a compelling alternative for countries in the Global South.
An alternative platform.
Yeah, and one of your sources points out, importantly, that this isn't necessarily about abandoning existing institutions like the UN or the WTO. It's more about gaining more leverage, a stronger collective voice on the global stage. And this really aligns with Brazil's historical role, its foreign policy tradition of advocating for and empowering developing economies.
Okay, let's shift back to the U.S. approach to BRICS. We touched on the U.S.-South Africa tensions, but more broadly, it sounds like there's potential for increased pressure, maybe especially with the possibility of a new Trump administration.
Yes, one of the sources we looked at suggests there's a potential U.S. intention, particularly under that scenario, to try and, undermine BRICS. How? Through economic threats, targeted sanctions, maybe trying to exploit any internal divisions within the bloc. Tariffs were specifically mentioned as a potential tool.
So using economic leverage.
Right, and that kind of external pressure would inevitably have an impact on the internal dynamics of BRICS and, of course, the priorities of the nation holding the chair, which, as we said, will be Brazil next year.
We've heard a lot, especially recently, about BRICS exploring alternative payment systems, moving towards trading in their own local currencies. How might this potential U.S. pressure affect those efforts?
That's a key question. While there's definitely ongoing momentum within BRICS to explore these alternatives, you hear about it a lot, it's really important to understand that moving away from the U.S. dollar as the dominant global currency is, frankly, a long-term and incredibly complex undertaking.
It's not flipping a switch.
Not at all. It requires massive cooperation between central banks, building robust financial infrastructure, liquidity tools. It's complicated. So the current efforts within BRICS seem to be more focused on, say, diversification, reducing their exposure to potential risks associated with the dollar, like sanctions, and creating alternative mechanisms rather than posing an immediate existential threat to the dollar's global dominance.
But the interest is definitely there.
Oh, absolutely. The strong interest from countries like Russia and Iran in establishing a BRICS payment system, plus public statements from leaders like Lula confirming that work is underway, it indicates this remains a significant long-term goal. But remember, BRICS operates on consensus.
Right, which can mean slower progress.
It generally means progress is incremental, stable, rather than rapid and disruptive.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's focus specifically on Russia's relationship with South Africa and maybe the broader African continent.
Yeah.
It seems like Russia has been paying increasing attention to Africa in recent years.
Yes, that increased engagement is certainly evident. You see it in the Russia-Africa summits they've held over the past decade.
But how deep does it go?
Well, that's the question. One of your sources points out that the actual trade volume between Russia and most African countries remains relatively low. It's quite concentrated with North African partners like Egypt and Algeria.
So the historical ties are there, from the Soviet era supporting independence movements.
Exactly. Strong political ties historically. But the current economic engagement is described in one source as somewhat shallow.
So with Russia now heavily focused on its own economic diversification, finding new trade routes, especially eastward, How might this impact its relationship with African nations?
That's a really interesting point, and the long-term impact is, well, still somewhat uncertain. African countries, remember, have a diverse range of international partners, now China, obviously, but also the Gulf states, Turkey, Brazil, India. They have options beyond just Russia.
They're not solely reliant.
Not at all. One source suggests that both Russia and African nations maybe need to reevaluate their partnership for the 21st century, move beyond just government-to-government interactions to foster deeper connections, academic exchanges, business collaborations to build, true mutual understanding.
Speaking of other nations stepping up their engagement with Africa, Turkey has also become a much more prominent player, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Turkey's increasing focus on Africa as a key area for foreign policy diversification really seemed to take off in the mid-2000s, particularly as its aspirations for, say, EU membership became less likely.
So they pivoted.
Pretty much. And we've seen a significant surge in Turkish trade and investment across the continent since then. Plus, various educational and cultural initiatives, especially strong in Muslim-majority countries. Turkey's also playing an increasingly visible geopolitical role in places like Somalia, Libya.
Using multiple tools.
Yeah, exactly. A combination of economic, political, even defense tools, which makes them an appealing partner for many African nations. The fact that Turkish defense equipment, like their drones, is seen as cost-effective is also a significant factor.
And they've opened a lot more embassies too, right?
Substantially increased their diplomatic footprint, yes. Their approach seems very multi-layered, very adaptable. And one of your sources even mentions soap opera diplomacy.
Soap opera diplomacy.
Yeah, Turkish TV shows being popular across the region as a form of soft power. It's quite a strategy.
That's fascinating. Okay, this all really highlights the growing importance of South-South cooperation. But what are some of the key obstacles that need to be overcome to make this cooperation truly effective? It sounds good in theory, but...
Right, the execution is key. One of your sources really emphasizes that while multilateralism and South-South cooperation are, frankly, pragmatic necessities for Southern countries to have their voices heard in today's fragmented world, there's a real need to move beyond just the rhetoric.
Get down to brass tacks.
Exactly. They need to clearly articulate the unique value proposition of South-South cooperation and then scale it up in a meaningful way. And importantly, be careful to avoid replicating the pitfalls of traditional Northern-led aid models.
Are there specific examples of where it's falling short?
Well, the underutilization of existing mechanisms like the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, is noted as a missed opportunity. Also, just a general lack of sufficient knowledge and kind of organic spaces for engagement between different regions of the global south. Like, how much interaction is there really between, say, Africa and Latin America at a deep level?
Oh, we got enough.
Likely not. So strengthening complementarity, interdependence, mutual understanding that's crucial to reducing reliance on traditional partners while still acknowledging the current realities of global trade. The key message really is the need for concrete action, tangible cooperation, not just, more meetings and discussions.
Action, not just words.
Got it.
Got it. Now, let's touch briefly on Canada's potential role in all of this. It was interesting that one of our sources, citing Channel Analytics, indicated some level of Canadian interest, or at least curiosity, about joining BRICS.
Yeah, there seems to be some public chatter about the idea. However, the expert perspectives shared, like Matthew Eretz, suggest that Canada maybe has its own internal issues to resolve first, needs to demonstrate a greater willingness to, as he put it, play properly with others on the international stage before it could be considered a serious decision-making member of BRICS.
But potential benefits were mentioned.
Yes, he does see potential benefits for Canada down the line, particularly in participating in large-scale economic development projects, like the Polar Silk Road or the Belt and Road Initiative.
There was also a kind of cautionary note raised, wasn't there? Referencing France's historical experience, suggesting a similar reservation for Canada.
That's right. The idea presented was maybe a 5 to 10-year observation period before any serious consideration of membership. It really underscores the need for a deep, genuine commitment and a clear understanding of the long-term implications before a country like Canada jumps into such a significant global bloc.
And the author focusing on the Arctic development potential.
Right. The author of Why Canada Must Join the New Silk Road points to those opportunities for Arctic development, perhaps in collaboration with Russia and China as potential drivers for closer ties. But, Internal divisions within Canada are also acknowledged. Some advocate for even closer ties with the U.S., maybe even becoming the 51st state.
That old chestnut.
Exactly. And the current uncertainty surrounding the future direction of the United States just further complicates Canada's strategic thinking.
The source also touched briefly on some recent Canadian political shifts. Mark Carney becoming Prime Minister after Trudeau stepped down, a potential election looming. The explanation of Canada's system, the Governor-General, Privy Council, oaths of secrecy, it does highlight a somewhat unique structure.
It does. And Mark Carney's background, former head of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, certainly brings significant economic expertise. The speculation mentioned around Chrystia Freeland's expected succession versus Carney's appointment, well, it adds another layer of intrigue to Canada's potential future path regarding BRICS and the wider world.
Okay, let's shift focus now to the dynamic between two absolute key players within BRICS, China and India. Despite their, long history of rivalry, it seems like there's a noticeable move towards greater cooperation recently.
Indeed. That imagery used by China's President Xi Jinping, the elephant and dragon, needing to dance together, that really signals a significant potential shift in their relationship, or at least the desired direction.
And the border standoff being resolved helps.
Undoubtedly. The resolution of the border standoff at the line of actual control, the LAC, since October 2024, that has definitely created a more conducive environment for deeper cooperation. And this move towards collaboration seems driven by both hard economics and geopolitics.
How so?
Well, together, China and India represent over half of global economic growth. That's massive. Plus, with Western economies facing various challenges and the U.S. increasingly using sanctions as a foreign policy tool, both nations increasingly see perhaps a mutual benefit in collaboration rather than just continued rivalry.
And it sounds like BRICS itself is playing a really important role in facilitating this cooperation, positioning itself as a credible alternative to maybe Western-dominated global institutions.
I think that's a fair assessment. BRICS is actively pursuing strategies to reduce reliance on the U.S. dollar, things like bilateral currency swap agreements, developing regional payment systems, India's rupee-ruble trade, China's CAPS system. These are concrete examples of a pragmatic approach towards achieving greater economic autonomy.
So not necessarily a unified BRICS currency yet, but smaller steps.
Exactly. While a unified currency might be a very long-term aspiration, these more localized solutions are already contributing to a gradual weakening of dollar dependence. And it's important to grasp, I think, that this shift seems primarily driven by a desire for economic resilience, independence, not necessarily like an ideological rejection of the dollar itself, more about protection.
It's interesting, though, that despite U.S. efforts to maybe pull India away from China, sanction threats over the S-400 missile purchase and things like that, India has continued to pursue its own independent, multipolar foreign policy.
Yeah, they seem determined to carve their own path, engaging with both the U.S. and China while also strengthening ties within BRICS.
So the old U.S. playbook isn't working as well.
It really highlights the limitations of that traditional U.S. foreign policy approach of trying to keep China and India at odds. There seems to be a growing recognition, even within Washington circles apparently, of both China and India as major centers of innovation and economic power in their own right.
And India is still in things like the Quad and AUKUS.
Right. India's continued participation in those Western-led alliances while also being a key member of BRICS, and the SKO really underscores its commitment to this multipolar strategy. And look, BRICS has already surpassed the G7 in purchasing power parity terms.
That's a significant milestone.
It is, and with strong economic growth projected for its member nations, this trend seems likely to continue. Plus, the expansion of BRICS in 2023, bringing in strategically important oil producers like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, that definitely presents a potential challenge to the long-standing petrodollar system. Which leaves the U.S. with what options to counter BRICS? Well, somewhat limited options, according to the sources. Sanctions. Countries are finding ways around them. Military threats. There seems little appetite for major conflict. Economic pressure. Global interdependence makes that tricky, too. It's a complex picture.
Definitely. Okay, shifting gears again slightly. The idea of using sports for diplomacy within the BRICS framework seems like a really interesting, maybe often overlooked aspect of their cooperation.
Yes, that BRICS Plus Sports Roundtable held in Moscow really highlights a deliberate effort. using sports as a tool to strengthen cultural understanding, foster broader cooperation. They're building on the success of the BRICS Games held in Kazan earlier this year.
Promoting different kinds of sports, too.
Yeah, emphasis on both traditional Olympic sports and national sports from member countries. Kabaddi, lapta, belt wrestling are mentioned. The idea is to encourage greater cultural exchange, and the development of a BRICS Plus Football League is also a notable initiative.
So it sounds like the BRICS nations are actively working to develop their own sort of independent sports institutions and increase their influence in the global sports arena.
Precisely. Larisa Nikolaevna Zelentsova, who heads the BRICS Alliance of Strategic Projects, explicitly emphasizes sports as a powerful tool for diplomacy and cooperation. The source material also touches on this idea of the weaponization of sports by what's termed the collective West.
Against countries like Russia and China.
Right. Suggesting that developing BRICS sports structures could potentially offer a counterbalance to perceived biases within existing international sports organizations, maybe even with some UN mediation down the line.
And involving civil society, too.
Yes, the importance of recognizing, supporting, and collaborating with civil society organizations in this effort is also highlighted. BRICS countries seem to see organizing sports structures as a way for their citizens to actively participate. They're also exploring using UN platforms to promote BRICS sports activities. A past event on training for people with disabilities was mentioned as a successful example.
Interesting angle. Okay, now let's delve into the really complex issue of Iran's nuclear program and how its membership in BRICS and the SKO is playing into the broader geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, recent developments certainly paint a picture of, well, evolving dynamics. You have the continued U.S. accusations against Iran regarding Houthi operations, contrasted with the more measured diplomatic responses and, significantly, joint military exercises conducted by Russia, China, and Iran. Those Maritime Security Belt 2025 exercises, for example.
And Beijing hosting that meeting of deputy foreign ministers.
Yes, from Russia, Iran, and China, specifically to discuss the Iranian nuclear crisis. That's a particularly significant development, I think.
What came out of that meeting?
A joint statement, apparently, reaffirming UN Security Council Resolution 2231, that's the one underpinning the original nuclear deal, and emphasizing the need for diplomacy and restraint, especially against what they see as illegal sanctions.
So presenting a united front, essentially.
Pretty much. It reflects a shared commitment to a non-confrontational approach, at least publicly, and it really highlights the strengthening ties between Iran and these major non-Western powers since Iran became a full member of both BRICS and the SKO in 2024.
Which signifies a real shift in global power dynamics.
It really does.
Yeah.
With BRICS nations, led particularly by Russia and China, increasingly asserting their independence and actively working to reshape the world order by building these alternative security and economic partnerships.
Of course, the history of Iran's nuclear ambitions is long and complicated itself.
Very much so. Starting with U.S. support way back, then evolving through the revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, increasing international pressure. For Iran, the sources suggest developing a nuclear program has become deeply intertwined with its sense of self-defense, national pride, and, well, pursuing greater independence on the global stage.
And joining BRICS fits into that strategy.
Absolutely. It's seen as a key part of a broader strategic effort to challenge what Iran perceives as Western dominance and to help build a more multipolar world order. Remember the JCPOA, the 2015 deal?
Yeah, the nuclear deal.
It placed limitations on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for lifting some sanctions. But the U.S. withdrawal in 2018 led Iran to gradually abandon some of its commitments. And the ongoing technical advancements, enrichment, centrifuges, that continues to raise concerns about potential dual-use applications.
And sanctions have obviously hit Iran's economy hard.
Hugely. But Iran has also been developing what it calls a resistance economy, and it's getting increasing support, particularly from China and Russia, through platforms like BRICS.
Which then creates regional security concerns, especially for Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. It's a really complex geopolitical knot. But the key point from the source material is that BRICS nations aren't just passive observers anymore. They're actively reshaping this landscape by providing Iran with a significant platform, a kind of multilateral shield, contributing to this broader movement towards what they frame as a more equitable world order.
Okay, finally, let's examine Russia's perspective. Its increasingly strong commitment to BRICS. One source used the phrase, all in on BRICS, which really seems to capture the current strategic thinking in Moscow.
Yeah, that phrase feels accurate based on the analysis. Russia's strategic focus has definitely shifted. It used to be about balancing engagement with both the West and BRICS, but now it seems prioritizing BRICS is the clear path.
Why the definitive shift now?
Well, the prevailing view in Moscow, according to the sources, seems to be that the Western-led global economic system is just no longer a viable or reliable path forward for Russia. Sanctions are increasingly seen not as temporary measures, but as a permanent feature of the landscape.
So they feel forced to pivot.
Essentially, yes. Forced to accelerate integration into a new financial and trade network that is increasingly centered around the BRICS framework. The emphasis now is very much on achieving greater economic sovereignty, prioritizing domestic industries like manufacturing, energy, defense, technology, aiming for greater self-sufficiency. One source even drew that historical parallel with Russia's industrialization efforts back in the late 19th century.
And with stronger overall economic growth now projected for the BRICS nations compared to the G7, it seems like this strategic pivot by Russia has a solid economic rationale behind it too.
Indeed. The move away from dollar dominance in trade through using local currencies, alternative payment networks, bypassing SWIFT, BRICS investment funds, it all signifies a really fundamental shift. And Russia's made it quite clear, apparently, that Western businesses that left won't get special treatment if they decide to come back later.
What are the implications for the West?
Well, potentially limiting access to Russian resources, for one, and maybe diminishing overall influence over global markets as this alternative bloc solidifies. Conversely, it presents significant opportunities for emerging economies in Africa, Latin America, Asia to become more central players in this evolving global economy.
With BRICS acting as the catalyst.
Exactly. BRICS is seen as a key catalyst, maybe the key catalyst, for this broader transition towards a more multipolar world, with sanctions, ironically, having accelerated the process.
So as we sort of wrap up and unpack this wealth of information you've shared from these various sites, what are some of the key takeaways that really stand out to you? We've seen this picture of a world really undergoing significant transformation.
Yeah, world in motion.
With the BRICS nations playing an increasingly pivotal role, shaping everything from global trade, tech innovation, diplomacy, even as we discuss cultural exchange through sports. Your sources really paint a complex, dynamic picture. Lots of opportunities, but also, significant challenges in this evolving landscape.
What's particularly fascinating to me is the sheer interconnectedness of it all. How these seemingly disparate events link up. Consider how a local agricultural policy decision in Brazil could ultimately have ripple effects on global food security.
Or the sports diplomacy feeding into geopolitical goals.
Exactly. Or how the growing momentum behind alternative financial systems is so deeply intertwined with that desire for greater economic autonomy, resilience against potential geopolitical risks like sanctions. It's all connected.
We really hope this deep dive into these interconnected issues has provided everyone listening with some clarity, maybe some of those aha moments we always aim for here on the Unseen Wisdom. The tensions we discussed, the collaborations, the stated aspirations, they all seem to strongly suggest a multipolar world actively taking shape around us.
Absolutely. And maybe for further contemplation for our listeners, consider this. If the BRICS nations continue on this trajectory, increasing integration, expanding their influence across all these domains we've talked about, what might the long-term implications actually be for the existing global financial architecture?
The big picture consequences.
Yeah. And how could those shifts ultimately impact individual economies, maybe even filter down to our daily lives? It's a really crucial question, I think, to keep in mind as we all try to navigate this era of, unseen wisdom,